Deception enveloped the U.S. mission in Afghanistan. After 18 years, thousands of lives, and $1 trillion, what leaders and fighters really say about America's longest war. From arrest to prosecution, major disparities when it comes to justice and race in San Diego. And divine inspiration for San Diego's latest tourist attraction, the new Bible-themed resort opening this weekend in Mission Valley. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, KPBS military reporter Steve Walsh, Lori Weisberg, who covers tourism and marketing with the San Diego Union Tribune, NBC7 San Diego investigative producer Dorian Hargrove, and Lindsay Winkley, watchdog reporter with the Union Tribune. Well, the big news today, of course, is the historic vote by the House Judiciary Committee to impeach President Donald Trump. We're leaving that coverage to NPR and PBS, with the full House considering the matter next week. First up for us, following a 3-year court battle, the Washington Post this week published a series of devastating stories about what's really gone on in America's longest war. The confidential trove of documents show top Defense Department leaders and commanders in the field misled the nation about the war in Afghanistan over the past 18 years. Quote, making rosy pronouncements they knew to be false and hiding unmistakable evidence the war had become unwinnable. Now, Steve, these stories, they shock the conscience. I don't know how much news there is really there, but what are some of the main points revealed in this Washington Post series?
Well, that's right. This feels kind of like a one-stop shop of all the things we've learned about the Afghan war over the last 18 years. I don't think anybody thought it was going well up until this point. Anything that goes on for 18 years is going a little slowly, if nothing else. So, you know, the things that really were hit home here is there was no real clear strategy by either the Obama administration or the Bush administration or even the Trump administration for that matter. We would push the Taliban out of certain regions and then they would come right back in. We tried to attack the drug trade. The drug trade is now thriving. The Bush administration missed a real opportunity early on. About 6 months into the war, we kicked out al-Qaeda, which is why we started the war in the first place. We started hunting around for who was the real enemy here. We decided it was the Taliban because they had helped al-Qaeda, and unfortunately, the Taliban was indigenous to Afghanistan, and we were left with basically an insurgent war from there on out.
And as the Post says in the opening to their whole series here, didn't understand the culture, didn't understand the history. You know, the language, of course, was an issue, didn't realize what kind of a political system they had, all of these things going in, which was reminiscent, of course, of Vietnam, Iraq. I mean, these same criticisms of the U.S. in the misadventures there. Well,
that's true. I mean, the only pushback you'll get from the Pentagon on this is the whole notion that this was all complete lying here. They said these scenarios had come out. But it's very clear at one point, it was called a self-licking ice cream cone.
I love that line.
You know, it's a great line. It's basically we poured all of this money into the country to stop corruption, and we ended up creating even more corruption. Every time we wanted to change strategy, which Obama did want to change strategy, have a surge and then get out, you needed to go back to Congress and say that you were making progress. So you had to keep telling that there had been some progress on the ground. And the cycle just perpetuated itself.
And then it became kind of the forgotten war. We didn't even hear about it much in 2016 or even in 2018, right. The congressional elections. And until this came up this week, it's not on the radar.
Right. When Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, when he testified in his hearings before Congress, nobody even asked him a question about how things were going in Afghanistan.
Right. Lori?
So obviously, I'm sure you were about to say this, but you know, it's been much likened to the Pentagon Papers and how we were lied to about Vietnam. And even though, as you point out, maybe it doesn't come as a surprise that things weren't going well, but on the other hand, we were led to believe that we were. So how do we ever believe in our military people in the future? I mean, it's like a spouse who's been cheated on. How do I ever trust you again?
Right. Now, that is the question here, because clearly throughout almost from the very beginning, we knew we had no clear mission in Afghanistan. The question has always been, how do you extricate yourself without al-Qaeda returning? and there may never really be a solution to that.
Well, didn't the Russians go through this?
It was.
Was nothing learned from
Afghanistan was supposed to be their Vietnam. Well, apparently our Vietnam was really Afghanistan.
And yeah, we had a 10-year lesson from the Russians just before we decided to do this. Now, Steve, many local families, connection to someone served in the war, of course, obviously a military town. This has had a direct impact and a toll here in San Diego.
Oh, it always comes to mind the Dark Horse Battalion. Back in 2010, you had 25 Marines from Camp Pendleton killed in Helmand Province. Another 200 were wounded. 36 people lost limbs. To them, it's never going to be a forgotten war. Absolutely.
And the U.S. invaded and tried to occupy Afghanistan, of course, following the 9/11 attacks here. And as you said, the original mission, then the mission changed, the mission creep. You've got in Rumsfeld, the original Secretary of Defense in this, in the George W. Bush administration, saying, you know, I'm blind here. Who's the enemy? What's going on? I mean, this is the Secretary of Defense.
Indeed, the Secretary of Defense who seemed, I mean, at one point, the Bush administration were working with people that, in hindsight, according to some of these interviews, turned out to be worse than the Taliban. There were talk that some of these leaders had committed murder, mayhem. At one point, the Bank of Kabul nearly went bankrupt under the weight of $1 billion worth of fraudulent loans, many of them tied to the Afghan government themselves and people in power.
Now, we got a bite here from Donald Trump. He says he's only going to fight wars to win. Let's hear what he says at a rally.
They said when I was elected, oh, we'll be in a war in the first day, right? Remember that? No. But when we do, and if we do, and I hope we never do, we will win. We're going to fight to win. We only fight to win. We only fight to win. But if we are forced, we will avenge the enemy with overwhelming power, and we will win. Like the old days we won, then we went where we sort of played for ties. But we don't play for ties anymore. We don't do the tie thing anymore. Is that okay with you folks? Is that all right?
Yeah, well, 3 years here, and, you know, tie is at best.
Yeah, we're playing for a tie. Yeah, that would be the best case scenario. We still have 12,000 troops in Afghanistan right now, and we are trying to negotiate once again with the Taliban.
Well, I highly recommend this Washington Post series on the failures in Afghanistan. I do want to move on to another military topic, though. The budget passed this week, a $738 billion bill moving on to the Senate. High points of that one.
Right. Well, so they've reached an agreement between the House and Senate. This was important. You've got a deadline coming up next Friday to avoid a budget shutdown. Looks like the Senate will probably end up voting on this Monday night, maybe Tuesday. Some of the key points in this, Space Force will be in there. It's going to be a separate branch within the Air Force. You remember when President Trump came here, it was the first time he announced the notion of Space Force. One thing it doesn't have in there is it does not put back the $5 billion taken for the wall. It also, in the end, does not have language on it telling the president that he cannot remove more money in the future.
And 12 weeks for federal leave for federal workers, I should say.
Yep, extending federal leave to more federal
Not a thing
work.
Republicans were happy about.
Right,
So.
And a 3.1% pay raise, which is well thought of. Again, I think it's under the Trump administration, we've spent an additional $130 billion. So.
And before we leave this topic, another military story you've updated regarding sorry state of some of the military housing here.
Yeah, one thing that is included in this is some attempt to get a handle on problems with military housing. They're going to have, in this included, a tenant's bill of rights. They're also going to give more authority to commanders to actually have oversight of these contracts in private military housing, something that's really vexed them in the last year and a half while they try to get their hands on this.
All right, a lot of stuff to look forward to on that beat, which is always happening, certainly in San Diego. We're going to move on. Advocates in minority communities in San Diego and many other cities have long complained that law enforcement officers treat people of color, especially blacks, differently than whites. And for the second time in 3 years, a study here has concluded just that. Now, Lindsay, tell us about this latest study. Who conducted it and what did they find?
Yeah, so it was commissioned by the ACLU here, and it was conducted by Campaign Zero, which is a group that is really championing the elimination of unnecessary use of force by police officers. And essentially what it found, sort of boiled down deeply, is that blacks are arrested, searched, and suffer force more often than their white neighbors by both the San Diego Police Department and the San Diego Sheriff's Department. There was also some additional findings that weren't so much about racial disparity. For example, members of the LGBTQ community, as well as people who have disabilities, were more likely to be searched by both departments as well.
And this follows similar findings from a study, just 3 years ago, I think, and that involved San Diego State University. Right?
Correct. So the San Diego Police Department was the focus of that study, so the Sheriff's Department's not included. But what they did is, the study was a different set of data, so they were looking at just traffic stops, whereas this most recent study was looking at basically any contact between police departments and the Sheriff's Department. But what it determined was that while it was not more likely for blacks to be stopped by police, it was more likely for them to be searched once that stop did occur. And
you've interviewed a lot of policing experts here. You say it's tricky to parse out racial bias here from the data involving. It's a tough thing to study.
It is. I mean, I think that kind of beneficially, we have lots more data that looks at this issue. Everybody is very focused on pulling out numbers that can kind of that can say in a definitive way what many people, especially in San Diego, have been saying for a long time, what they feel has been happening to them for years, that disparity is caused by racial bias. And I think that people felt like, okay, if we can find numbers that say that, it will be easier to kind of propel this conversation to motivate departments to create change. But it's hard sometimes, right? There are a lot of other things that kind of feed these numbers.
Lori?
And in reading your story, it talks about, and maybe it's more the targets of the study, but they talk about, well, really the methodology wasn't quite right. It wasn't really fair. But I'm wondering, number one, is there really any right methodology that everybody's going to have consensus on? And second, is there enough here that will persuade law enforcement to make changes, or they think, no, it's just not a good study?
Right. What's their reaction, the police and the sheriff in San Diego?
Yeah. So for the first one, essentially what the argument of this particular data scientist, who actually is helping the state of California kind of go through RIPA data, so she's familiar with it. But essentially what she was saying was when you use population as a kind of a benchmark to look at this sort of disparity, you're essentially piling all kinds of sources of structural inequities on one source, right, on police departments. And we know, I think most of us understand, that there are a lot of systems that have built-in structural inequities that are separate from the police department. That being said, there are some statistical ways that people kind of try and cut down on that to really hone in on bias. This study was not particularly persuasive to our two biggest law enforcement agencies. I think they didn't. I don't think that they read it and said, okay, we need to create change right now. That being said, both departments have already asked for outside agencies to take a look at this very same information. And I think it will be very interesting to see what those results show, because if they're very similar, then I think that the department is going to be forced to take a hard look at this.
I was always wondering, as far as other, similar sized cities, I mean, I thought San Diego was always relatively low when you look at, other large cities in this disparity. I mean, the disparity's there.
The racial bias problem.
Yeah, and I think, that's this unfortunate thing that we all have to say is, yes, we all admit there's disparity. Mm-hmm. But it seems like in other large cities it's actually higher. I don't know if you looked into that or saw any of that.
Are you talking about the part of the study that talked about use of force?
Or not necessarily just this study, but what other cities have in terms of what the stops are versus...
Again, tricky to measure that among cities.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that we can all agree here that, disparity is not something that anybody is arguing about anymore, right? We all recognize that disparity exists. Right. And so I think right now the big focus is how do you drill down into these numbers to identify racial bias and do that in a way that sparks actual conversation and real change. I think that that's what people are really hopeful for.
Dory, I wanted to get on to your story. NBC7 investigated data regarding drug prosecutions locally. What did your reporting find?
So we looked at misdemeanor drug prosecutions by the city attorney's office. They handle all misdemeanors, and found that blacks are 5 times more likely to get prosecuted for minor drug infractions than whites and Hispanics. I thought it was interesting because, like what Lindsay was saying, as far as the disparity in stops and searches and everything else, I think you're dealing with a lot of factors, whether it's socioeconomic factors. A lot of factors go into that, and why that is, unfortunately, why that is. But then when you take it to the next step of prosecutions, I think it looks into really these people now enter the system, and now what? And for a lot of people, a lot of minorities, they're in it. And this is, this is one of the reasons. So that's why we wanted to look at that number and see I didn't know what the disparity was going to be when we got the numbers back. And I mean, 5 times is a rather large number.
And you mentioned comparing it to other cities. This kind of does mirror what's happening in big cities nationally.
It does. And we spoke to a district attorney in San Francisco, or former district attorney who's running in LA now. And he said the same. He was like, yeah, those numbers sound about right. And, when you hear that, it's kind of wow, that sounds right. I guess it's a good thing that San Diego isn't some sort of anomaly, but it's...
Steve?
My question would be, let's assume we accept the numbers, and at this point, you would imagine we'd be getting closer and closer to accepting the numbers. So what's the solution? If they did accept the numbers, what do you do about it?
Well, so this former district attorney in San Francisco that we talked to, he implemented this thing called blind prosecutions, where prosecutors do not get names, they don't get pictures at first, right? Even the neighborhood, like if it's a Chinatown or something, they wouldn't know where it was. And that's just to get out any kind of implicit bias that might be there. I think, speaking to him, I think more of it is, it's a sign to the community saying, hey, we're going to do whatever we can. Obviously, they're not going to say, yes, prosecutors are racist or biased. That's not necessarily the case. However, if you remove that just as a sign and a show, maybe it is something to build trust and get people behind it.
Right. Even if you just think, the community thinks that you're biased, that's going to impact on how effective you're going to be.
Well, yeah. And if that is effective, though, doesn't that show that there maybe is implicit bias at play? I think police departments over the last couple of years have definitely invested fairly heavily in implicit bias training, and I do think that helps, but I also think that we have to kind of look at these policies and procedures that we can put in place, or stopping practices altogether, because we know that people have implicit bias, and if you can avoid that by not giving them the option in the first place.
And certainly trying to hire more black officers.
And it was interesting too, hearing from that former district attorney and the candidate now in LA, is because he said he got major pushback from district attorneys' offices throughout the country, saying, hey, you were essentially throwing us under the bus now. And
blind prosecution.
Yeah. And he says, well, hey, it doesn't matter. This is a sign that shows we're willing to go at this, as fair as we can.
Well, we're going to move on, but it's a terrific one to follow up on. It's great reporting, very interesting stuff. Well, driving along I-8 in Mission Valley these days, it's hard to miss the gleaming new complex just west of the Highway 163 interchange. The sign reads Legacy Center, and it's a long-planned, very expensive legacy project for a televangelist, a Bible-themed resort. And Lori, you got a tour before the grand opening. Give us the overview here. Kind of describe what you saw.
So this is a pretty large site. It's an 18-acre site, and if you are, as you say, driving up the freeway, it's a very impressive-looking, very modernist kind of architecture with...
Yeah, it's a shiny new thing there.
Yeah,
in
with lots of glass and stone that came straight from a quarry outside of Jerusalem. But it's a complex of buildings, and it's, in part, the relocation of Morris Cerullo, this televangelist, his world evangelism headquarters there. It's got a 126-room resort hotel. It's got a conference facility. And it's got a number of religious-themed attractions, a parking garage, fountains, the catacombs, a replica of the Western Wall, and then this big interactive, so I haven't seen the technology yet, it wasn't in place yet, this big interactive world globe where you will be able to have touch screens and pull up, as visitors to the center, pull up different parts of the world to learn about them. There'll be museum-like exhibits of artifacts that Morris Cerullo has collected over the years, old Bibles and Torahs and etc.
So not like the creationism place out in El Cajon or Santee where you can ride a dinosaur and all of that.
Yeah, no. But I did leave out one big thing was that there's a motion theater, like 4D movie theaters, like think about Soarin' over California, California Adventure, that has some ties to that sort of thing, and it's going to be Journey Through the Bible and a sort of soaring over Israel too. There's 2 productions they're going to have.
And the fountains are pretty spectacular.
And then fountains
right?
if you've ever seen the fountains at the Bellagio, dancing waters with the
so Vegas meets the Holy Land.
Yeah, so yeah, not quite as many fountains, but that similar kind of look and feel.
Now, is this designed to be a destination in itself, a kind of Pentecostal theme park?
I think it is. I think it was in part, they don't like the word theme park, but these attractions make it feel like a theme park. But it's also a place where he can bring ministers from around the world that he trains, and they can come for conferences and then weddings and bar mitzvahs. I can't believe they've already booked a bat mitzvah there.
Well, that's interesting.
Even though it's very Christian themed.
It is, Steve.
My question was, why here? San Diego is kind of an expensive place. It would seem like you could do this more cheaply elsewhere if you wanted to.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it helps that Morris Cerullo's headquarters are based in San Diego. They were off of Arrow Road, so they relocated here. So that's a big part of it. Even though he travels the world, he is from here. But they do feel that no matter what the politics are in San Diego, that people will come, and they're hoping that they just have to be, evangelistic type Christians to come.
Does he want to see it as a tourist destination?
Yeah, I think in part, yes, yeah.
Lindsay?
Yeah, do they feel confident that this is going to attract enough people to be sustainable?
Yeah, how have other ones, similar type things around the country done?
So there's 3 main ones around the country. 2 are in Kentucky. One is it's like a real life Noah's Ark. It's kind of big like Noah's Ark. And then there's one in Orlando. So there's 3. I think they're doing okay. Ones in years past haven't done so well. Jim Baker's Heritage USA lasted about 10 years. But I think those are doing okay. Whether it works in San Diego, I don't know. I think there's going to be a lot of curiosity.
Yeah, you'd think somewhere in the Bible Belt, maybe, to get to Steve's point, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's going to be, hey, let's take the kids to SeaWorld and then go over to the International Center. I don't know.
How many rooms are there?
And so it's not a huge hotel. It's 126 rooms. It's a luxury hotel. They have
and a nice
couple
restaurant.
They're going to have a steakhouse in the restaurant. Then there's going to be a more casual restaurant near the fountains that they're calling the fountains. So they're hoping people will come, go to the fountains. They're going to have an indoor-outdoor retail market, kind of like the Middle Eastern markets that you may or may not be familiar with. And they're going to have vendors from around the world so people can come shop. They don't have to pay to go see the exhibits. They can just go shop.
One hump or 2 with your camel if you're going to be shopping. So tell us about the man behind it all. Morris Cerullo, he claims the vision for Legacy Center came straight from God, right?
That's right. Well, exactly. It's been a dream of his, he says, forever. He's in his late 80s. He wants to leave a legacy. As I said, they again also don't like the label televangelist, but he has used video and television over the years to spread his message. But he's a world traveler. Like I said, he trains ministers throughout the world, and then they in turn pass on his teaching. So he does have this ministry, but it's not like a church he has. I mean, you go in, you can see videos of him preaching.
Now, other denominations, Jews, Muslims, atheists, heaven forbid, they welcome there. Everybody, they expect non-religious people to use the restaurant, the hotel, the spa.
I could see non-religious people using it, it's a big question. The question is really out. Will non-religious people come? But maybe there's enough religious people to fuel it. They collected donations. They did this debt-free, so they raised money to do this, so that they're not in debt. I don't know how much came from. They're not saying how much came from their ministry.
They got the money. Steve?
Did you get a chance to talk to him? Does he feel welcome in San Diego? Like this is the sort of place that
opened up to everybody?
I was, in years past, there was always a reason why they wouldn't let me talk to him. I did talk to him this time, and there was some criticism from the LGBT community.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Not everybody's crazy about this project.
Yeah, because they felt that in his past, he has been known to advocate for gay conversion therapy. I don't know that he advocates for that now. So when I talked to him, I did bring that up. That was one of the things I brought up, and he said, I don't know what I can say basically to mollify these people, but I as you know, we just said, everybody's welcome. So he harbors no animosity toward anybody. I don't think the council was real. There was a close vote on the the council, but no, I shouldn't say it was a close vote. There were only 2 nays, but there were other council members who raised some issues, but knew that, you know, it met all the land use codes and they couldn't vote against it.
All right, a few seconds left. When is it officially open to customers? You can't really go there right now.
So there's a big over-the-top Christmas tree lighting ceremony this coming weekend, and then the following weekend, and so you can go in the public plaza, you can see the fountains, this one restaurant will be open, but not till February will all the bells and whistles with all this cool technology be in place.
So if you want to go to the restaurant or stay at the hotel or spa or anything else there?
The hotel opens in February.
Okay, so we'll be looking for that. And we should say it's right smack, I mean, the location's right there in Mission Valley, across from the Old Town and Country and Riverwalk Golf Course. It's right in the middle of Hotel Circle.
Old Town and Country's getting a huge overhaul too.
Yeah,
so
that's right. A lot of building going on right there. Well, construction workers are happy in the unions. Well, it does. We are out of time now. That wraps up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable, and I'd like to thank my guests, Steve Walsh of KPBS News, Lori Weisberg of the San Diego Union Tribune, Dorian Hargrove of NBC7 San Diego, and Lindsay Winkley of the Union Tribune. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.